And we are live. Chaim, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. How's my sound?
Your sound is perfect.
Good, good, good.
So, quick reminder for what Pride in the Living Room is all about. This project was founded by the Israeli LGBT task force Agudah in memory of the 2009 Tel Aviv Gay Center shooting and the Jerusalem Pride Parade stabbing in 2015. And Agudah founded this initiative to offer a voice and a stage to LGBT Jews from around the world, um, with the hopes of encouraging empathy and community. So all of that said, it is my pleasure to welcome you, Chaim, here to tell your story. Chaim, over to you.
Okay, so is this just like an open format, or do you have any like specific questions that you want me to be guided by, or like what are you aiming
Uh,
for?
I'm happy to start us off with some questions.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, so Chaim, you identify as Jewish
Yes.
and you identify as gay.
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
so talk to me. When did you tell me about your Jewish upbringing?
I grew up in the Chabad Lubavitch community in Crown Heights, in Brooklyn, which is in New York, which is in the United States. Um, the Chabad community, synonymous, Chabad and Lubavitch are kind of the same word. Don't mean the same thing, but they denote the same thing. Um, it is a considered a Hasidic community. Um, but there are many Hasidic communities in Brooklyn, as I'm sure a lot of people know. And the way I grew up was pretty religious, pretty conservative. Um, you were kind of expected or anticipated to follow a certain structure, a certain mold, a certain plan. Um, I did not follow that plan. I did until I was about 18 or 19. But at that point in time, after basically what in yeshiva, where I went to yeshiva for essentially my whole life until I left the yeshiva system at 17. I was outed by some classmates after I confided in one about something that had happened, about an issue. But at that time, I was referring to it in like terms of, oh, this issue I have, this sexual issue that I have. To make a long story short, which I know is not the goal of today, but to make a very long story a little bit shorter, I was outed and everyone found out. It was a pretty difficult time. I was away abroad in a yeshiva, Chabad yeshiva in France. And it was very lonely, very isolated. And I was 16 going on 17. And the year after that, I just left the yeshiva system entirely. And it wasn't my choice, but the Chabad world is pretty small, and so when someone has an issue at one place, the word travels around pretty quickly. And before I knew it, I wasn't getting accepted into any other yeshivas, and that was my end with the yeshiva world. I then I was just about 18, and I was very aware of the fact that I was attracted to men, but was obviously very unhappy about it. And I sought out, with the advice of a rabbi, I sought out conversion therapy. And before I knew it, I was meeting with a guy named Arthur Goldberg, who ran a group called Jonah. That was in New Jersey, which is right outside of New York. It was like, 15-minute train ride from Manhattan to where he was. And it was like a dream come true. It was this kind, seemingly kind older man who knew some of the Yiddish phrases that I grew up with, and he was like, yeah, here at Jonah, we've helped hundreds of people change from gay to straight, and this is what we do. I think they were, even at that point, were saying thousands of people. Now, I didn't have very much of an education growing up. I didn't learn in school. I didn't learn how to read or write or math or science or history or anything like that day to day where I went to school. After school, once a week, I had a tutor for an hour who taught me spelling and some math, but very little compared to what most children and most young people learn every day. So I didn't really have an understanding of human sexuality, aside from the fact that sexuality wasn't very openly discussed in my world. I didn't really have an understanding of it. I didn't understand what being homosexual meant, other than it was considered a bad thing, especially considering the way my classmates treated me when I was outed. So I was like the perfect candidate for conversion therapy, people who basically profit off of the vulnerability that I found myself experiencing. They swoop into religious communities, they target parents and rabbis and influencers within the community, and you can send your kids to us, we'll cure them. By the time I had gone to Jonah in 2007, many people, and I would later on learn that almost all of the older people in the Jewish gay community that I came to meet later on, they'd all been impacted by Jonah one way or the other, either through family or having a flyer of Jonah given to them by a parent or something, or having gone like I did. So I was a perfect candidate. I was 18. I was naive. I was very motivated. I was at that, I had a lot going on, but I was very into it. It was very confusing because I had never ever left that world for any reason. I always stayed within the confines of the Chabad Lubavitch world. Never had to, never interacted with people who weren't exactly the way I was. And so here I was, and Jonah was for Jews. So I was meeting up mostly with other Jewish people, but I had never even met with other Jewish people who weren't exactly like the kind of Jewish person I was. So, it was a big deal. In a way, it pushed me out of my comfort zone. I did conversion therapy for about 1.5 years. I went to some retreats that they recommended and some that they hosted. I participated in workshops. I participated in weekly group sessions. I participated in weekly individual sessions with what was referred to with someone who called himself a life coach. This goes back to my lack of education, not knowing the difference between a life coach and a psychologist and what that meant and the distinctions and the importance of those distinctions. And then after 1.5 years, I left. I didn't just leave one day. Something pretty traumatic happened, something that I've talked about many times, including in open court, something that I don't like talking about anymore, but just to get it out there, I'll say it. This life coach had me basically disrobe in front of him in a locked room. And it was that session, it was actually October time. So it would be about 12 years ago, right around now. It was over the Sukkot holidays. I had recently met up with a guy and did something I at that time wasn't supposed to do. I was feeling very guilty about it, and he said, you need to remove these layers, these negative messages, layers of shame. And he had me standing in front of a mirror, holding a staff, and he had me craft negative messages that I was telling myself, and with each negative message, he would instruct me to remove an article of clothing. I wasn't interested in it, and I didn't feel comfortable doing it. But when you're in that situation, it's a really complicated power dynamic, because on the one hand, you're being told, our therapy always works. If it doesn't work, it's because you didn't try hard enough. On the other hand, I have my community, my family saying, just straighten yourself out, be like everyone else. And so I did what he told me to do. I took off an article of clothing at a time until I was standing there with no clothes on. And then he one of the big things about conversion therapy is that they're very focused on masculinity, and to them, homosexuality is a product of lack of masculinity, which is absurd, but for another day. And so when I was standing there without any clothes on, he said to me, you need to, which part of your body do you think represents your masculinity? And he had me touch my private parts. Again, I resisted. Again, it was the same dance. Like, this is the work you have to do if you want to change. I did it. I put my clothes back on. I left, and I said to myself, I'm never going to tell anyone what happened in that room. I knew in my heart, I knew in my brain, I knew that was messed up. That shouldn't have happened. Slowly but gradually, I start falling out of the conversion therapy bubble. I went back to one group session with that life coach hosted, but I would not go to an individual session with him because my body was like, you can't go back into a room with him. You're not safe. And, but then through the more time I spent on the internet, I eventually met someone who was part of the JQI community. And then back then it was a very informal community, but it existed. And I met up with this person who today I would consider him, I mean, I'm not very close to him anymore, but at that point in time, he was the kind of hero I really needed, he was just a regular guy he was still religious. And I, at that point, was already, not fully keeping Shabbat and other things, but he's told me he explained to me how I'm fine and that it's okay to be gay. And he sort of just desensitized me in a way. I think at that point I was filled with a lot of fear of gay people, even though I was technically hanging out with fellow gay people at conversion therapy. I meant like outwardly gay people. He gave me the attention and the kindness that I really, really needed, in a way that was positive and healthy, and he was also honest with me. He showed me a documentary about Harvey Milk. It was called The Times of Harvey Milk. And he really, really helped. And he introduced me to other JQI people, which then led to me going to a Purim party. And that was really my moment, where the Purim party at the JCC in Manhattan, I was terrified, but I went. The minute I walked in the room, everything changed. Everything in my life changed at that moment, because suddenly I was like, oh, okay, so here's all these people. They're doing fine. And you're like these people. They're the same. There were people who were Chabad. There were other, kind of like Orthodox people, formerly Orthodox. It changed me in a radical, amazing way, because I didn't like go on the next day and go online and tell everyone I was gay, but I started feeling this feeling inside of me of, oh, okay, you're fine. You're going to be fine. This is okay. You're not doomed. You don't have to worry all the time. You could start worrying about your other problems, because I had a lot of other problems that needed to be worried about. But and slowly I started coming out. I never had a moment where I told my parents I was gay, but it became obvious. And what's amazing is that when I look back at that now, at the time, that moment was an amazing moment in my life, but it would be the beginning of a very, very difficult decade, because within a couple of years, I was basically living on my own. My parents had kicked me out of their home multiple times. And so one of the first things I started worrying about in my 20s, and was a very constant theme of my 20s, was where am I going to live and how am I going to pay for it? So there was always that going on in the background, but but what I did was I started thinking about the fact that this was 2009, 2010. Nobody was talking about conversion therapy. Even the words conversion therapy were not used. I think, everyone used their terms, which was reparative therapy. Conversion therapy was actually created by a group of lawyers to sort of, I don't know exactly why, but so reparative, people who do conversion therapy say that I don't do conversion therapy because they're just misappropriating the words, or they're using different words. So I started looking around and talking to people, and it was like no one was talking about this. And I went on a Shabbaton kind of thing, where a few JQI people, we were invited to University of Pennsylvania to speak over the course of a Shabbat. And I was going to talk about conversion therapy. And this was pretty much the first time I spoke publicly. And while preparing for it, I told one of the directors of JQI, it was really an accident. I told him about the incident with the life coach. And the floodgates kind of opened from there, because once I told one person, I suddenly was like, okay, I'm going to tell everyone. And what I learned very quickly was that it was happening to other people. And this person was basically getting away with what I would consider at least sexually predatory behavior. There were situations that I learned about over the last 10 years that I think could be amounted to sexual assault. But this was the summer, I think it was 2010, where I appeared in a YouTube video with my friend Benji Unger, who I actually met at Jonah, and I talked about this therapy session. And one of the first things I realized was most media outlets were very reluctant to cover it. They were very afraid to write these allegations, obviously, because they didn't want to get sued. Even though it's much harder to sue here in the United States than it is in other places. It was very frustrating, because I was like, Jonah was very forcefully in existence at that time. They were advertising in the Jewish press. They were doing PR. They were fighting, and they were fighting back against me and my efforts. I think, but they viewed me and Benji as like, oh, these just two schmucks who will go away. Turns out we were their worst nightmare. But at the time, we were very young. We were in our early 20s. We didn't know anything. We came from very sheltered backgrounds, but we knew that there was something wrong and that something had to be done. So I kept talking about it. I kept writing about it, blogging, social media, anywhere I could. To anyone who would listen, I told them what happened to me at Jonah. I made sure, and I guess, now I don't know if I would do that, but at that point, I didn't really have the filter, and I think in a way it helped me. About a year in, I was contacted by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a civil rights group here in the United States. They successfully at the time, fought off and basically bankrupted the Ku Klux Klan. Sadly, the Ku Klux Klan is making a little bit of a comeback right now. So they were a pretty prominent group, and they were doing a campaign against conversion therapy. And they asked me if I wanted to be the face of it, where my name was on flyers and a couple of small billboards. Of course, the answer was yes. And then within a few months, they were like, okay, we think we want to file a lawsuit on your behalf, and we want you and we want your mother or one of your parents to join, because my parents paid for it. And ironically, despite all the weird things that was happening with my parents and the complicated stuff, my mom did agree to participate. I don't think she knew what it would entail later on, but she agreed. So my mom, me, my friend Benji, my friend Sheldon, my friend Michael, who is a Mormon, and Sheldon's mom, we filed a lawsuit against Jonah on November 27th of 2012. No such lawsuit had ever been filed before, and we sued them for fraud. We were basically saying that they were selling something that was impossible to sell. They were selling a product that was by default, it was an impossible thing to be selling, and therefore they were committing fraud. And they were advertising in a newspaper and digital, so that made it more complicated for them. And that was like a crash course in law and just firsthand experience, because at some point in time, a year and a half later, I had to sit for my deposition, which was 3 days long. I went from being an annoying loudmouth who was writing things about them on Facebook to a very serious threat. And that's why my deposition was the longest, because they were really going after everything in my life, every failure. And I was 23 at that point already, and I had a lot of failed jobs and different, problems, things that you can attribute to a lot of things. But, their job was to make me feel like a failure as a person. And at the time, I can't say they successfully did, but they definitely, they made it harder. 2015, at the end of June and the end of May, we started the trial. It went on for 5 weeks. We won. And over the next few months, we came to some sort of agreement with them where they agreed to shut down. What we didn't know at the time, what we knew at the time, was that they formed a new organization that was supposedly, they claimed, to promote morality and biblical values. In 2017, we got one of their tax documents, and we saw something that flagged something, and we ended up back in court. We found out that they broke the agreement that we made with them. They got slapped with a major fine of $3.5 million, and that is now still being litigated. But they don't know, they don't exist anymore. An official Jewish conversion therapy group does not exist in the United States. However, there are still practitioners of conversion therapy in Jewish communities in the United States. What's tricky is, like I said earlier, people change the words. They say, "Oh, I don't do conversion therapy. I don't do that." But they're doing it. They're just using a different word for what they're doing. It could be counseling a young Chabad man and trying to convince him that he hasn't discovered the true potential of his bisexuality, and while at the same time peppering him with falsehoods and negative things about gay people and how if he lives a gay life he's going to be miserable. Those are all forms of conversion therapy. They're not as extreme. They don't involve going into the woods on intense, emotionally draining retreats or inappropriate sessions with life coaches, but it's still conversion therapy. So I like to think that I definitely contributed to the fight of it, but by no means is the fight over. One of the things I learned also after we won our lawsuit was that they had really moved a lot of, not their own operations, but similar operations to Israel. There's one weekend called Journey into Manhood, which was the center, one of the big part of our lawsuits, that was translated into Hebrew for Atzat Nefesh, which is an Israeli conversion therapy group. And so they've spread out what they're doing. And it's something I think about a lot. I am not engaged in any more lawsuits of this nature anymore. And I don't know if I would in the future, but it's something I think about a lot, and it's something that bothers me. I think about the many men and women in the Chabad community who cannot come out because they're afraid of losing everything or losing their family. In 2016, when the lawsuit ended, I created a Facebook group for LGBTQ Chabad people. We have about 125 people in it. It's not a very active group. It was at a time. I wanted it to exist as a space for, just so someone could join the group. We're pretty strict about who joins. You have to be, have been Chabad, or we have to know who you are, just so that they can join and see that, oh, there are these people, maybe someone they know, and that helps with the lonely part. But the Chabad world has thousands of people in it, and we only have 125. So mathematically speaking, we're nowhere near capacity for how many actual queer Chabad people there are. But it exists. I'm proud of it, and and that's part of what I like to think about when I think about what I've done over the last 10 years. But I think that now in the political climate we're in, over the last year, a classmate of mine, it became clear to me that he was gay, and we've interacted a little bit online. But I've realized that he's very conservative. He's very Republican. He likes Trump. And I think, and most of the Chabad people who I used to know and used to be friends with, most of them are Trump supporters. And that has more than anything, that has created a massive divide. And so even this guy who, I don't know, in normal times I would have caught up with him and like, hey, what's going on? How have you been? What has your process been like? But it's been so weird and difficult to connect with people in that bubble. And I think that that's contributing to a lot of polarization. I don't know who to blame for that. I've reflected on how much I've contributed to the negative culture of social media over the last 10 years, and have hoped and strived and continue to strive to want to be better. But we're going through some pains right now here in the States and the world in general. But this is a difficult issue. But I hope, for the sake, I've friends with a few guys who are married to women, who, and their wives don't even know, but they're in the closet and they're attracted to men. Some of them are having sex on the side. And that was also, for me, when I was in Jonah, one of the first people I met was a guy who, I'm not going to say anything about him because he's very closeted, and even if anyway, he was married and is married. And I remember, like a year and a half in, when I was really starting to leave conversion therapy, I asked him, I said, I know it's not a fair question, but if you could do it all over again, would you? And he said, no, absolutely not. And I said, it's not a fair question because he had like several children. But he told me that, you know, his struggle and his pain was so much that he struggled so much that he wouldn't do it again. And so when I talk to these guys who are struggling, who are in the closet, I think about that part of myself who almost ended up that way. Had I been like my older brothers and my sister and gotten married and swallowed up, then I would have been that person. And I'm so thankful that I'm not, even though I've paid a major price, you know, financially, emotionally, just for that act of being myself in the confines of my family and my community. I would never, ever, ever take it back. Okay. I feel like I just answered your question 10 times over without any prompt from you. So
I just want to say thank you so much, Chaim, for giving us a window into your life. You've had an experience which is unfortunately all too common amongst queer people who have grown up in religious environments. And yeah, for you to be able to dive into that headspace again and rip out that piece of yourself and put it on display again for the purposes of sharing your story. I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, it's a privilege for me because as exhausting as it is to do this, which is why I don't do it very often, it's so important that people know, for obvious reasons, just so that people feel less alone, so that people can learn something. You know, it's something we have to do. So it's a privilege to even be part of this. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So going all the way back to the beginning, you're talking about growing up in a Lubavitch environment, and then can you talk a bit about what the experience was like to first have that realization that you saw the world a little bit differently, that your body reacted a little bit differently?
Like when I realized I was gay?
Yeah.
Well, the thing about part of my story unfortunately involves childhood sexual abuse. And so obviously my first exposure to sexuality was not what most people would consider healthy or good. And so for me, this from the ages of 10 until basically when I came out, what I thought I was doing was I was fixing a problem that was brought on by this abuse. And so it was confusing to go through puberty and start finding men attractive while trying to make sense of what had happened to me, which was, obviously a bad thing, and not allow that to consume my sexuality entirely. So, in that sense, I guess nobody's journey is typical, but that made my journey a lot more complicated and confusing. And it made it very easy for the religious people in my life and the conversion therapists in my life to say, oh, well, obviously you have same-sex attraction because you were abused. And if you just overcome your abuse, you'll overcome your same-sex attraction, which, creates a very bad dynamic for someone who is just trying to come make peace with things, because if you don't overcome it, then you're giving in to the abuse that was wrought upon you. So it was a very confusing time in my life. And, being in an all boys yeshiva, away in a dorm, having to go to the mikveh every day, communal showers with no separation, just a big room with 300 guys. It was, and I'm not exaggerating that, it was hard. It was very hard and very confusing. In many ways, I put my brain on autopilot and just said, you have to kind of get through this and not let yourself be aroused or fazed by what is going on around you. But it obviously was not an easy thing. And the time I was in survival mode, but when I look back on it, I truly just, I actually feel bad for myself, and I feel bad for everyone who is like me, who is in that situation. I don't think anyone should be in that situation.
Mm. You know, Chaim, the amount of conversations I've had with particularly gay men who have experienced child sexual abuse, and they have spent a lot of their life, as you say, sort of reckoning with their attraction to men plus this abuse, and what does that mean, and are they correlated, and are they causated? What, you know, and it's extremely confusing.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you for again for having the honesty
Yeah.
in this space to be able to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned that in the Lubavitch space, I mean, putting gayness, putting, you know, same-sex attraction aside for a second, just in general, sexuality isn't really spoken about.
Hmm.
Um, so what does that, I mean, whether someone grows up gay or straight or bi, what does that sort of, how does that manifest?
It's problematic. I have to see, the one thing about the Chabad community did not resist the internet the way other Hasidic communities did. And so the access to the internet and social media has forced many Lubavitchers to come to terms with the fact that people like Chaim Levin exist. You know, I'm not saying that, I'm not proud of this, but most Lubavitchers have heard of me. And when I meet them, they're telling me, oh, I've heard of you. And so I often hear from young people who are trying to find their way. There were a few over the last few months, but it's hard. It's very hard because you can't, you know, you're going through something that is very natural, but you're being taught that your desires, even just the desire to masturbate, which is something that most people do, is and so evil, and that every time you do it, you have to fast 89 times. You know, that's what they teach in the Tanya. That is so, in my opinion, that is so unhealthy. Um, how do people? I guess I don't know the answer to your question, other than I think everyone hopefully copes somehow. Some people unfortunately don't, and they don't make it. But they have more options today than they did 10 and definitely 20 years ago, which is good, which is good. But there's a long way to go. And I'm not even talking about, you know, I used to think, oh, wow, it would be so great if Chabad as an institution acknowledged LGBTQ people. Excuse me, but fuck that. I'm not even talking about that. Because like, I don't believe that would ever happen. Beyond that, I think just what needs to happen, I guess, and what I'm trying to say is what needs to happen is happening. Exposure is happening. It's not happening as fast as I'd like it, but every day there are parents in the Chabad world and beyond who have to, you know, come to terms with the fact that their child is not straight, and it's happening more and more, and that's good. I just hope, and you know, really hope that those parents and those families do no harm to their child and their sibling and their relative. Unfortunately, I've heard, you know, I recently heard a story. It was over the summer that a young man contacted me, and his experience was so sad and so enraging. I was so upset after I spoke to him. He had just had such a bad experience, and this was recent. And so, you know, that has to change, obviously, and I hope it does. For me, you know, right now, I don't live in New York City, and I do not go near or into Crown Heights, partially because of the pandemic, but also for my sanity. The more disengaged I am from the Chabad world, the healthier I find myself. but it's a kind of, I'm feel pulled in two directions, because I feel like I should be continuing to advocate and engage with, but you know, the other flip side of that is, well, you got to take care of yourself, because if you can't take care of yourself, you can't do anything. And so I teeter on both edges. Even just the group itself, I want to see the group be more active. I want to see more people join, but I physically do not have the time and emotional capability of doing that right now. It's a responsibility, it's work, it's time, it's effort. And in my current life, that is a very secular, non-affiliated life, diving into that is just bad for my health. So hopefully, you know, I more and more I'm meeting young people who I'm inspired by, and I'm hoping the right young people or young person will come along and be like, hey, I want to get involved, I want to do it, let's take it to the next level. And I'll be all, you know, I'll be there in the background to support them and egg them on and encourage them and mentor them if necessary. One of the greatest things that I get to do now is I get to talk to young people, and I get to do for them what that guy did for me all those years ago when he introduced me to JQI and just helped me accept myself. I've got to do that so many times since. And every time I think about him, and every time I tell the people who I'm helping, I say, when they say, how can I thank you or whatever, I tell them, one day there's going to be a young person who seeks you out and needs your support, and you're going to do for them what I did for you, and you're going to carry on a good cycle of goodness. And that's one of the best parts of all this.
I have one or two more questions, if that's okay.
Go ahead. Sure.
And I'll also just add that everything that you've been saying, you know, the audience of this project ranges from Orthodox Jewish people to LGBT non-Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there will be a piece of your story that either resonates with someone's experience or introduces them to a new story that really opens up their mind. So
okay.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So a lot of your sexual life has been based around unhealthy situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you to sort of flip the switch. Can you talk about, are there any sort of positive, healthy sexual experiences, maybe a kiss, maybe a cuddle, something that you'd like to share with us?
I will say that I've thankfully had many wonderful experiences over time. Unfortunately, and maybe this is, you know, and I don't know if this is a rule, but for me, you know, the shadows of the abuse, you know, they live within me. They don't really go away. But you know, I think I saw this in maybe Queer as Folk once or something, or a quote I heard where one day somebody's going to hold you so tight, and you know, and everything's going to be better. And whenever my boyfriend squeezes me or cuddles me or, you know, holds my hand, it's special. I never imagined that I could be this happy and be this lucky. I never thought I deserved it, but here I am, and I'm surrounded by love. I'm surrounded by acceptance, and I've, you know, I can say that I've been able to experience my sexuality in a healthy way, in a good way, that you know, that is not what it initially it was.
What does Judaism mean to you these days?
That's a complicated question. I don't know. I culturally, I have to. I'm automatically Jewish. Maybe it's because I love chicken soup, or because I don't know. There's this idea and this concept of connection where we're all connected to each other, whether we, and I recognize that connection. like I said before, it has gotten a lot more difficult over the last few years because many in the Chabad Lubavitch world are very big Trump supporters. And to me, that really flies in the face of everything they taught me. And it has just made it hard to really be around them. I'm connected to, I'm happy to say that I'm now experienced the full spectrum of Judaism from all different elements, and I'm connected with all different types of Jews, and I love that part. But I don't observe, I don't keep anything, I don't follow any of the, any of the rules. Sometimes I fantasize about just Shabbos in terms of keeping my cell phone locked away for a day, but otherwise, maybe the food. And just the Jewish world, when and if I ever come visit Australia, I'm going to be visiting a lot of Jews because those are that's kind of the denominator where, like, wherever we go, there's always, that doesn't automatically mean that because, there's another Jew in the room that they're a good person or a trustworthy person, but there's that connection. And I'll never be able to get rid of that, even if I want to. And I don't necessarily want to, but sometimes the exclusivity of it and, fellow Jews, and we're here looking out for our fellow Jews, it makes me a little uncomfortable because we should be looking out for everyone. But those are existential, philosophical questions. So I connect with my Judaism and I don't know how, but I do. Some one way or the other, whether it's by eating chicken soup or having a good argument with some Orthodox Jews about sexuality on Facebook. One way or the other, I'm connected.
Chaim, what gives you strength?
What gives me strength? I don't know. I give me strength, and not to sound like, not in an arrogant way, but I have had to, fight for myself. And I think we all have that in us. And I, by doing what I want to do, by following my dreams, that gives me the strength and the motivation to wake up every day and, and do what I have to do. My freedom, my independence, my ability to choose, my ability to make choices, those things give me strength.
I have one final question.
All right, go for it.
The question is, what is your favorite season of RuPaul's Drag Race?
Honestly, you would have to ask my boyfriend that question because he watches it a lot more religiously than I do. I have this thing where no matter what is going on, no matter what I'm watching, even if I really love it, I will fall asleep. And so I've fallen asleep through many of them. I did hear about an episode that on RuPaul's Drag Race Canada that was Celine Dion themed. I have not seen it, but I know that would be my favorite episode whenever I see it. Okay. I'm a Celine-aholic, if you will.
Can you give us a taste of
No, not right now. But right before the pandemic happened, I got to see her at Barclays Center in Brooklyn in the 10th row, and I took my mom, and it was very, very special. I frequently look back at the videos and just try to bask in the amazingness of it. I actually hope to meet her one day, even though I don't know why, because I don't think we should be idolizing people, but anyway.
Yeah. I think it's always good to end up with a smile. So
yeah. All right.
That's my last question for you, Chaim.
Okay, great.
I just want to say thank you so much for for again bearing your soul. As you were saying, you've spoken about this topic on Facebook and court cases all over the show. And I can say for myself, whenever I speak about my experience, it really feels like I'm taking the innermost personal, private pieces of myself and saying, hello, world.
Yeah.
I thank you for going through the emotional toll it took to tell your story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's my pleasure. There's one more thing for me to say.
Okay.
Is to sharing our story in this moment and many more moments in the future. Thank you, Chaim.
Amen. Amen. Take care. Have a
You
great
too.
day.